Late 2013 and early 2014. After years of corrupt governments, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians take to the streets, not for a concert, not for a football match. They're out there to bring down a pro-Russian regime, mafia style, rotten to the core. This was Euromaidan, a revolution with blood on the asphalt, banners in the snow, and over 100 dead in the heart of Kyiv. A full-on popular uprising for a Ukraine that's transparent, democratic, and dignified. Now, nearly 12 years later, with Ukraine under invasion, one of the country's worst fears has almost come true. That everything they fought so hard to achieve in the battle against corruption could collapse in an instant.
Zelensky dismantles Ukraine's anti-corruption infrastructure and subdues law enforcement.
Yes, you heard that right. This headline, straight from Ukraine's own media, gives us a pretty clear picture of the political climate in the country right now. Just a few days ago, on July 22nd, the Ukrainian president signed a controversial law previously passed in parliament that basically wiped out the independence of Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies in one fell swoop, placing them back under government and political control. A legislative move that, luckily, didn't last long.
Zelensky approves new bill restoring independence of anti-corruption bodies after protests.
Faced with a storm of protests, both inside and outside Ukraine, Zelensky has promised that in a couple of weeks, he'll bring a new version of the law to a vote to basically reverse course. But the damage is already done. This move wasn't harmless for Volodymyr Zelensky. It was a serious misstep that's left a stain on his record. Take a look.
After the bill passed, hundreds of people gathered in Kyiv for the biggest anti-government protest since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022.
It's been days of absolute political turmoil. Thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets. Young people, the elderly, students, workers, all with one clear message. This is not okay. Yes, Ukraine is still at war, but that hasn't numbed its democracy or its determination to keep moving forward. Still, no matter how you look at it, this move has been pure fuel for anti-Ukrainian or pro-Russian hordes around the world. But above all, it's been gasoline for many factions of Trumpism, who finally got the perfect excuse to post what they've been dying to say on X.
Huge protests erupt in Kyiv against Ukrainian President Zelensky, as he is a dictator and refuses to make a peace deal and end the war. And America must stop funding and sending weapons.
Anyway, everyone's got their own crazy take. But one thing is clear, this move was terrible, and honestly, pretty hard to make sense of. So here at VisualPolitik, we started asking some big questions. What's this all about, really? What were Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament trying to do with this law? Why the sudden U-turn? And where does this leave Zelensky now? Well, that and a lot more is what we're going to unpack in this video. We are pretty sure some of what we'll show you, you won't see coming. Let's dive in. Alright, let's get straight to the point. On July 22nd, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law that overnight completely changed the rules of the game. From that moment on, anti-corruption agencies would report directly to the prosecutor general. And who appoints the prosecutor general? That's right, the president. In other words, Zelensky himself. And no, this isn't just some legal technicality, it's not boring paperwork, it's not some minor footnote, no. This reform represented the biggest institutional setback in Ukraine since the fall of the old regime. And the worst part, this law was introduced right in the middle of negotiations with Russia over the war. Yep. During the toughest months for Ukraine since the invasion began, the government went after one of the core pillars of the Euromaidan revolution.
Russia and Ukraine hold third round of talks in Istanbul.
That's why many Ukrainians felt like the government was trying to sneak this one in through the back door, and right at a particularly delicate moment. Because this past week, Russia and Ukraine held their third round of peace talks in Istanbul, this time with the US mediating. The results? Pretty much zero. The only thing they agreed on? A swap. 1,200 prisoners from each side. But beyond that, nothing. Ukraine insists on a total ceasefire before any deal is made. Russia, on the other hand, argues the opposite. Let's negotiate first, and maybe later stop shooting. And why can Putin afford to play it that way? Because due to the summer offensive, Russian forces have kept making slow but steady progress. For example, their troops are already entering Pokrovsk, a key city thanks to its road network, its logistical importance, and its symbolic value. Another shiny trophy Putin's been eyeing, if they manage to take it of course. But easier said than done. All signs point to this turning into yet another brutal urban battle. And to make matters worse, this whole reform we're talking about didn't come alone. It came after a wave of police raids on the homes of anti-corruption agents. Raids based on flimsy excuses like traffic incidents from years ago, or supposed drug cases. Naturally, a lot of people are now asking, what the hell is going on here? Can Ukraine really afford to gut its own democratic safeguards right when it needs Western support the most? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at next, so stay sharp.
Playing with fire.
Alright, let's lay all the cards on the table. If there's one thing that's haunted Ukraine almost as much as Russian tanks, it's corruption. That's where the most important post-Euromaidan reforms came from: the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. These two institutions became the closest thing Ukraine had to an independent anti-corruption elite force, and they were pushed for by the European Union, which made them a key condition for any future accession talks. We're talking about institutions born when Ukraine was trying to claw its way out of the mud left by the pro-Russian era of Yanukovych. That president infamous for being more corrupt than a Monopoly game with a bunch of Bolivarian politicians. After the Popular Revolution, the guy fled to Russia, but he left behind a system rotten to the core, and that system had to be cleaned up. That's the context in which NABU and SAPO were created, two agencies supervised by international observers and funded with help from the EU and the US. And what was the goal? To make sure the government couldn't investigate itself. These offices had autonomy. They didn't answer to the Prosecutor General. The government couldn't tell them what cases to open or close. They couldn't interfere. And VisualPolitik community, that was crucial in catching more than a few shady characters. But then suddenly, Zelensky comes along and says he's not such a fan of that anymore.
The Prosecutor General, a man 100% loyal to the president, will decide who and what cases will be investigated, and who and how will provide procedural support from the prosecutor's office. Therefore, we can expect the closure of several high-profile cases, such as the Chernyshov case.
And here's the thing, pay close attention. This law was passed by the Verkhovna Rada with 263 votes in favor and just 13 against. In other words, this wasn't just a legitimate law, it came with overwhelming support from the active members of parliament. So, as I was saying, with this reform, both NABU and SAPO, that's Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, lost their independence and were placed under the control of the Prosecutor General. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means their autonomy goes up in smoke. They'd now be legally required to follow orders from the government's chain of command. Specifically, the reform says they must take instructions from the Prosecutor General who, let's be honest, isn't exactly some neutral technocrat in round glasses and a white lab coat. We're talking about a political figure appointed by the president. And sure, confirmed by parliament, but let's not forget, Zelensky's party holds an absolute majority. So yeah, do the math. With this reform, the president would effectively gain control over what cases get prosecuted and which ones don't. Or at least, that's what was about to happen, because the pressure from inside and outside Ukraine has forced the government to commit to undoing it with a new reform. Now, how important is all of this really? Well, just think back to the case of Oleg Tatarov, the deputy head of the president's office. NABU was working on a bribery case that pointed directly at him. And at the time, the Prosecutor General already tried to block the investigation. We're talking about cases that might seem almost trivial. For instance, Tatarov was accused of giving a parking space to a top official. We're not talking about millions and millions of dollars here. Still, that alone was enough to make headlines, and some of them tried to link the president to shady practices. And that, at the end of the day, is a problem. Let's not forget what we said earlier. These anti-corruption institutions were part of the EU agreement to bring Ukraine closer to Europe. Their existence and their autonomy were non-negotiable conditions for receiving funding, assistance, and cooperation. Think of it as the instruction manual Europe handed over to help Ukraine avoid becoming just another corrupt eastern outpost. But of course, now it's 2025. There's a war, there are no elections, and martial law is still in effect. Even so, tens of thousands of Ukrainians poured into the streets in what became the first major protest since the war began, because the idea that the war might lead to democratic backsliding or weaken public institutions, that's sparking outrage. And that raises the big question. Why on earth, in the middle of an invasion, is the government doing this? What was Zelensky thinking? Well, listen closely.
If it slips through, it slips through.
Let's get one thing straight from the beginning. This law didn't just fall from the sky like a rain of Russian drones. No, there's context and there's timing, and all signs suggest that none of this is coincidental. So how does the Ukrainian government justify it? What's the official story? Zelensky says it's mainly about stopping Russian infiltration, about protecting the state, and making sure no one from the inside can sabotage the fight against the Kremlin. Which of course sounds very patriotic, very heroic, but what if the real motives were something else?
The anti-corruption infrastructure will work, only without Russian influence. It needs to be cleared of that. Of course, the NABU and the SAP will work. The Prosecutor General is determined to ensure that in Ukraine, the inevitability of punishment for those who go against the law is actually ensured.
The truth is, there's nothing major in the law that actually targets these supposed Russian infiltrations directly, aside from, well, requiring employees from several agencies, including the anti-corruption ones, to take polygraph tests in order to access state secrets, or the ban on NABU personnel traveling abroad while martial law is in effect, unless it's for official work trips, and that's not all. Just one day before the parliamentary vote, an unprecedented legal storm broke out, with dozens of searches carried out on more than a dozen NABU agents. Some of them were targeted over traffic accidents from 4 years ago. Others faced more serious accusations like alleged ties to drug trafficking, and yes, even links to Russia.
NABU said that at least 70 searches had been conducted in relation to more than 15 of its staff members in different regions of Ukraine. According to NABU, there is no evidence that its employee detained by the SBU was involved in anti-state activities.
But hold on, this part is key. According to the SBU, Ukraine's National Security and Counterintelligence Agency, just a few days ago, 2 NABU officials were arrested under accusations that would actually support Zelensky's argument. One was allegedly a Russian spy. The other had reported business ties with Moscow. The SBU claims one of them went as far as collecting and sending data on Ukrainian security agents and other citizens directly to the Kremlin. They even gave a number: over 60 potential transfers of restricted information to the Russian FSB, Putin's intelligence agency. This might point us to something important. Maybe neither NABU nor SAPO are completely free of Russian interference, even though, to be clear, there haven't been any formal convictions in these cases yet. Maybe Moscow has managed to infiltrate these agencies. The real question is, how deep does it go? And that we simply don't know. But beyond the motives behind these arrests, they did happen just one day before the law was changed. And VisualPolitik community, there's even more.
Ukraine's top anti-corruption activist faces charges that his team calls political vendetta.
Right now, Vitaly Shabunin, one of Ukraine's most well-known anti-corruption activists, is on trial. This is a guy who spent years being a thorn in the side of those in power, demanding transparency and calling out corrupt officials. And suddenly, bam, he's got a legal target on his back. But it doesn't stop there. Zelensky's party has also tried to sneak in another law, one that would grant amnesty in certain corruption cases related to defense contracts.
Zelensky's MPs propose full amnesty for crimes related to arms procurement. The draft law also provides that the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO, will no longer be able to investigate abuses in the defense sector.
Yep, exactly as you heard it. And come on, do you have any idea how much money is flowing through the defense sector right now with the war ongoing? Now imagine the government saying, hey, don't worry, if someone dipped into the cookie jar or delivered faulty equipment, it's all good. So yeah, between the law that was passed and thankfully now being reversed, and this new proposal, Ukraine isn't exactly sending a message of transparency and trust to its partners. Because let's be real, suggesting that corruption in defense contracts might go unpunished, that's the last thing that you want to do if you're hoping for more funding and more weapons.
EU could stop financial support to Ukraine over Nabu-Sapo issues.
And honestly, the timing couldn't be worse. First, because Trump's United States has started cutting off weapons deliveries, leaving the Europeans to shoulder the entire cost. And second, because right in the middle of peace negotiations, no matter how they end, the last thing you want is to risk your allies losing trust in you, tightening the purse strings, or slashing the flow of aid. But it's not just what was done, it's also how it was done. This law against the independence of anti-corruption agencies was filed back in January, but the final steps were rushed through way too fast for something of this magnitude. The amendments, the vote, and the president's signature turning it into law all happened within just 24 hours, and let's just say not everyone was thrilled about that.
What happened in the parliamentary chamber today was shocking. The bill was passed despite clear procedural violations. The servant of the People Party deputies applauded. It was like a witch's Sabbath.
VisualPolitik community, as you know, Ukraine has all our admiration. First, for standing strong in the face of such brutal aggression, and second, for its determination to keep existing. But let's be real, the country still faces serious challenges. We can't forget that Ukraine has long been the poorest country in Europe, and arguably the most corrupt, second only to Belarus. Now, yes, in recent years, there's been a lot of progress. Zelensky's own government has pushed forward many reforms that improved Ukraine's political architecture, but naturally, there's fear that one wrong step could send it all crashing down. But hold on, this isn't just about Ukraine. There's another big player in the mix. Donald Trump, or more precisely, what Trump's rise has meant for Kyiv. Because unlike Biden, who demanded and supported anti-corruption reforms as a condition for aid, Trump has pretty much washed his hands of Ukraine altogether. And let's not forget, the funds Ukraine used to receive from the US have dropped dramatically, not just military aid, but also through other channels like US Aid. That agency had spent years funding rule of law reforms, independent media, and civil society groups, all fighting corruption right there in Ukraine. The result? Less international pressure on Ukraine, and more room for the government to act without so much outside oversight. So yes, maybe Zelensky does genuinely see this as a way to stop Russian interference. Maybe he does believe the prosecutor general needs more power to be effective. Maybe all of that is true, or maybe not. Either way, it's completely understandable that people are worried. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering if all these anti-corruption reforms were designed to help Ukraine eventually join the European Union, and Ukraine is now officially a candidate for EU membership. But then what's Brussels saying about all this? Well, as you might expect, things have been heating up over the past few days, and with good reason. Here's what's going on.
Zelensky, what are you doing?
Besides dreaming of winning the war and watching Putin retreat with his tail between his legs, there's something Ukraine has been longing for years: joining the European Union. It's a historic, strategic, and symbolic symbol, a way of telling the world loud and clear that Ukraine's place isn't with Moscow, it's with Brussels. But of course, you can't crash the EU party without cleaning your shoes first, and that's where the anti-corruption fight becomes absolutely essential. The European Commission has said it over and over again. If Ukraine wants to move forward in the accession process, it needs independent judicial and anti-corruption institutions. They need to work. They need to be free from political control, because here, clean governance isn't some technical details, it's the front door to the club.
The European Union is concerned by Ukraine's recent actions regarding its anti-corruption institutions. These institutions are crucial to Ukraine's reform agenda and must operate independently to combat corruption and maintain public trust.
Translated into EU diplomatic language, it would sound something like, "Zelensky, my dear, what are you doing?" Because seriously, you can't go knocking on Brussels' door asking to be let in while at the same time it looks like you're dismantling the internal safeguards meant to keep corruption in check in what's still considered the most corrupt country in Europe. And the truth is, Zelensky's move has left a lot of people in Brussels and across the EU scratching their heads. Ukraine continues to receive massive amounts of financial, military, and diplomatic support, but that doesn't mean it gets a free pass. Brussels doesn't want to let in another member state with weak institutions, prone to scandal and flirting with authoritarian tendencies. They already have their hands full with Orban's Hungary. The EU is not going to let authoritarian-style reforms sneak in through the back door. So even if the official rhetoric is still full support for Ukraine, the message between the lines has been more like, hey, Fix this, and fix it now. In fact, countries like Germany, France, and the Netherlands are demanding explanations. Others, like Estonia and Lithuania, have, for the first time, expressed concerns over these reforms in Ukraine. Although, to be clear, they've separated this issue from their ongoing military and economic support for Ukraine's war effort. But there's still one question left to answer. Why on earth did Zelensky make such a risky move? Why gamble with his international image right now? Did he do it just to protect his inner circle? Well, yes. But also no. As usual, the answer is more complex than a simple yes or no, and it has everything to do with the situation Ukraine is in right now. Because, let's be honest, Ukraine is in a state of total war, a brutal, exhausting war with no clear end in sight. And it's a war that's not only fought on the battlefield, it's also fought in politics, in public morale, in government stability, and of course, in international narrative. And in the middle of all that chaos, do you really think the Ukrainian government can afford a major corruption scandal or leaks about defense contracts, no matter how small, that spark headlines across the West? That wouldn't just weaken the government, it could fracture national unity. And in the middle of a war, without unity, you're done. Zelensky knows very well that wars aren't won only with drones, tanks, and sanctions. They're also won by maintaining a clean, strong, and unified story, both at home and abroad. And to do that, he needs to prevent a political firestorm inside the country, just as Russia is stepping up its attacks like never before since the war began. So now, the big question is, do you think Zelensky will recover from this misstep? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. Let's get a debate going. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already. As always, thank you so very much for being there. Take care, I'll see you next time.